So how are communities actually structured? First of all, we look at species richness. So within a community, there can be different types of species. And then there are relative abundance of those species. Some will be more common than others. Then we have the physical characteristics of the organisms. So for example, in very arid areas, some plants will have very thick, succulent leaves, and this is to reduce evapotranspiration. So that is to stop water evaporating from the leaf, and that's an adaptation to that environment. And then lastly, the trophic relationships among interacting populations within a community. This refers to the way in which energy is transferred through the system. So you remember from biology, school days, you've been taught that green plants had a compound called chlorophyll, and that was able to capture energy from the sun. And by using carbon dioxide and water through a process called photosynthesis, they were able to generate a carbohydrate, an energy source. So how is this energy transferred through the community? Well, basically, it's transferred through a series of what we call food chains. And these are intricately linked to create a food web, which you can see here. Now, at the very base of the food web, we have the phytoplankton. And phytoplankton are really the foundation of oceanic food webs. And they contain chlorophyll, so they are generating this carbohydrate source. Now, in turn, they are fed upon by the krill, which are herbivores, so they're primary consumers. And in turn, they are fed upon by the leopard seal, which we call a predator, but we also call a carnivore. And a third title is a secondary consumer. And so energy is fed up through these chains, and actually only 10% of the original energy is passed on at each stage. So that puts a limitation on the number of steps you can have in any one food chain. And it's usually about 3 or 4, which is what you can see in this oceanic one here. So you've got the phytoplankton, step 1, and the krill, step 2, leopard seal, step 3, and the smaller toothed whale, step 4. And the reason that you can only have that many levels is because these higher trophic level species require to consume an enormous amount of these lower trophic level species to be able to survive. So there is only a certain level of primary producers, and so only a certain number of the higher trophic species can be supported. So we've talked a little bit about interactions between populations in the community. And we've touched on herbivory already. So there's another example here. This is an epilobium species. That's the primary producer, the plant. And to the right is a hawk moth caterpillar. So that's our herbivore. That's the primary consumer. And we've also touched upon predation. So these are secondary consumers. So on the lower right-hand side, we have the water vole. That's a herbivore. And on the left is an American mink, which is our secondary consumer. So these are some very, very basic sort of connections in the food web. But there are 3 other interactions within the populations that I want to talk about. First of all is parasitism. So this is a symbiotic interaction in which the parasite actually derives part or all of its nourishment from a host, which is either harmed or in some cases is actually killed in the process. Now, the first example I want to give you is a hemiparasitic plant. And by hemiparasitic, we mean that it only derives part of its resources from its host. So this example is Rhinanthus minor, the yellow rattle, which is depicted here in the photograph. And it latches on to competitive grasses such as Holcus lanatus. And by doing that, it impedes their growth. So this is a fantastic plant to aid restoration of grasslands, for example, because by sowing out the Rhinanthus minor seeds, you can actually impact on some competitive grasses, which opens out the sward to enable less competitive herbaceous plants to come through. The second example I want to show you are parasitic Hymenoptera. So these are the parasitic wasps. And here this depicts a Chelanian rosé, which is actually a tarantula, which is about this size, just to give you an idea of scale. I mean, it's so large, you can see it walking across the road when you're driving along. So this photograph was actually taken in Argentina. And it's been paralysed by the parasitic wasp, which is now dragging it off to the nest. And it will be brought down into the nest, and the eggs will either be laid on top or within that host. And when the eggs emerge and the larvae emerge, they will feed on that host. So ultimately, this parasitism case will actually involve the death of the host. So the second example I want to talk about is mutualism. Now, mutualism basically means that there's an interaction between two different species, and the interaction results in a mutual benefit for both species. So there's nothing more classic than the example of the large blue butterfly and the red ant interaction. So basically, the large blue butterfly caterpillar feeds on wild thyme and marjoram, and when it reaches its third instar level, it starts secreting a honeydew substance which attracts the red ant species. The red ants then carry that caterpillar down into their nest, still feeding on this honeydew secretion. And the caterpillar there can actually feed on the red ant eggs. So there's this mutual benefit from both sides. And the large blue butterfly will end up hibernating over winter there, so they'll turn into a chrysalis. And in fact, incredibly, the large blue butterfly can actually mimic the pheromones of the red ant and noises that the red ant makes just to ensure its survival in the nest. Now, when the next season comes around, the blue butterfly emerges and is actually taken up to the surface by the red ants, which then surround it and actually protect it as it pumps up its wings, ready for its first flight. It's an incredible relationship, a very classic example.